So it's my pleasure to introduce our speaker today, Arye Hillman. Professor Hillman is Emeritus Professor of Economics at Bar-Ilan University, and he's had a long and distinguished career in our profession. He's taught at several universities in Australia and in the United States, including Princeton. Arye will be known to many of you as the longtime editor of the European Journal of Political Economy and as the founder of the long-standing Silva Plana workshops. He's both an editor of and prolific contributor to political economy. His textbook, Public Finance and Public Policy, now in its third edition, I think, and translated into several languages, is worthy of special mention because, so far as I'm aware, it's the only public finance text that takes political economy seriously throughout it, rather than confining it to a chapter or two at the end of the book. I first encountered Arye's work on the political economy of trade in a nice piece he published in the ER with co-author James Cassing in 1986, and I met him shortly after that. We're both somewhat older now, I think. He's made important contributions in several fields, including the theory of clubs, rent-seeking, behavioral political economy, excuse me, and the political economy of development. In the latter field, he's known for a Nietzschean view of development failure, in which the problem is not corruption, but rather weakness of the rule of law and property rights, so that the strong appropriate the output of the weak, undermining incentives to be productive. One of the features of Arye's work that I enjoy is the combination of grand themes and analytical detail, such as found in the work on in his work on development. And today we're going to hear a new paper of his, which has a similar flavor, one that deals with history, a topic which those of you of a certain age may agree, seems to become more interesting and attractive as one gets older. Now, this paper concerns the history of political economy in a grand experiment conducted in the first half of the 18th century in what is now the state of Georgia. This was an experiment which took some of the poor from England in order to give them a new, more prosperous life in an egalitarian society. It failed, and Arye retells this story. I'd never heard of this experiment before. Looking at the paper, I'm looking forward to the details. Arye, over to you.
So, as you're all aware, the one thing I've never done is written a paper on economic history. So I always ask people when they write about something, how did you come to this topic? Well, I sometimes read a little bit more widely than just economics or political economy. And I was reading a book, if you can see this, it's called The Americans, by a man called Daniel Boorstin, which is quite interesting because actually my mother's name is Bornstein, and I assumed that this Boorstin, an American, condensed his name a little bit. And I was reading on all the different colonies of the English, and then I came to Georgia. And there I saw something which to me was quite novel and amazing, which was that they decided, they being the English, decided in 1731 that they would set up an egalitarian society in Georgia. Now, of course, we are all interested in egalitarian societies because some of us believe that these are the way to social justice and equality, and we know about equality aversion. And so I looked for some literature on this egalitarian experiment, and I found absolutely nothing in economics. Now, I've been looking for a long time. If someone can tell me about something, that would be very good. I did find a very comprehensive literature by the historians. So I'm going to tell a story, and my story is really a detective story, because we have two questions which are interesting. Why did this egalitarian project fail? And secondly, was it really an egalitarian project for social benefit? Or were these people, as I call them, were they pawns? And were they bait for a war which eventually came about? I've tried to communicate with historians. I believe a problem is the language that we use. I didn't realize how specialized we were when we talk about the concepts, which I'm going to use here. I find in the history literature there are different views, and what I've tried to do is put everything together. I am a great believer in the book The Rhetoric of Economics by McCloskey. And the main theme of McCloskey's book, published some years ago, is that we're all storytellers. And McCloskey says we tell our stories in different ways. Some tell the story mathematically, some tell the story empirically, some tell it analytically as an economic historian. I am going to retell a story that you could find. You'll have to read a lot of history books and different summaries, but basically I'm relying on secondary sources. In some cases I come close to primary sources. A book in the 1850s, for example. But basically, I want to use the concept of political economy, the concepts, to answer the question why this project failed and whether it indeed was a social project. The person who has written the most about this Georgia project is Professor Julie Ann Sweet of Tillau University. She takes a rather optimistic view of it all. What's going on is that in England at the time, we have Walpole, the first prime minister. Politics now becomes mixed with self-interest. The king is George II, and the 30 Years' War is in the background, and there's conflict with Spain, which were part of the story. So what does Julie Ann Sweet say? Let me quote her. She says, "This was a time in which a board of elite philanthropists and entrepreneurs administered the colony from abroad in hope of creating a utopia of small, industrious, virtuous landholders." A beautiful utopian story of intent. Then when you go to what David Bronstein says, he says, by the time of the American Revolution, Georgia, the darling of philanthropists, the spoilt child of charitable London, was the least prosperous and least populated of the colonies. And let me read you another quote. I won't have many quotes. Borenstein says the following: "The poor inhabitants of Georgia are scattered over the face of the earth. Her plantations have grown wild. Her towns are deserted. Her villages are rubbish. Her improvements are a byword. Her liberties are a jest. And she is an object of pity to friends and of insult and contempt and ridicule to enemies." What could be a worse outcome than this? So we have to ask ourselves, what happened? How did this all come about? My first idea was that if this is an egalitarian project, I have to look at all the other egalitarian projects and see if there is a parallel. Because I was looking for the fatal conceit of Hayek. Now, Hayek's fatal conceit was, as you know from his book, I believe 1987, that you cannot transform people to contribute for the social benefit without regard for their own benefit, which is what communism sought to do. And by the way, did succeed for a long time on the kibbutz in my country, which I a little bit close to. One of my daughters married a young man from the kibbutz. It was a very interesting story. for me to go there and see how indeed they cooperated without regard for personal benefit. But the Georgia project did not have collective benefit. The Georgia project was egalitarian in that everybody received the same inputs, and everybody received a price that they could sell their output for, and the output was due to be silk. So we're still left with the question, why did it all fail? I am going to retell the story. First of all, I will start with the background. From the background, I will go on to who has been blamed. Then we'll go on to who I blame. And then we'll go on to a very interesting story of two groups of people who were not part of this project. The English did not send them, and they came independently. And they are two groups of whom it is said that if the whole project was consisting just of these people, the project would have been successful. And who are these groups? I will elaborate later. One is a group of Jews, and one is a group of people who are called the Salzburgers. And they are from the Salzburg region in the mountains. And these two groups were more or less successful. But before I come to all of this, let me talk about some background. What I would prefer is that if you have a question, just ask me. If I know that I intend to come to an answer to this question in a minute or two, then I will say, please wait. But if it is a question which can be answered on the spot, I will do that. So up to now, it's been by way of introduction. Now I come to the background. Well, the English decided that they were going to improve the welfare of a group of people who were the most miserable in London. You had to make sure that the people who will be sent to Georgia have no productive contribution to England. And then there were also social benefits. They said if we send these people to Georgia, crime will diminish. England will go rich by sending the poor abroad. And the settlement would take in the numbers of poor people that pester the streets of London. So the English saw this as a contribution to themselves and a contribution to these people. It's one of these cases where there's improvement everywhere. They benefit by being brought to Georgia, they said, and the English will benefit by them going. They did an estimate that a family, not telling us how many children there are, in England at the time required £20 sterling to survive. Of this money, they estimated that £10 sterling was earned by the people themselves, and an extra £10 sterling was a subsidy from the rich society. Recall at this time, in this history, at this time of history, there was hardly a middle class. The incipient industrial revolution was there, perhaps, but the middle class was very small. You were either a landowner and rich, depending on where you were in the line of the family, in the inheritance laws, or you were quite poor. There was no, of course, public education. Now, they estimated that if these poor people went to Georgia, they would earn £60 a year, as compared to the £10 they were earning in London. Moreover, they were mercantilists, so they believed that there would be a benefit, and the benefit would come from silk. They estimated that if these people produced silk in Georgia, this would save England £500,000 sterling a year from having to buy silk from Italy and I believe also from China. So when the first Georgia settlers arrived on the good ship Anne, and then they had to be transported from South Carolina down to Georgia, they brought with them the requisites of silk production. They brought white mulberry trees, which silkworms eat, the leaves. They brought the silkworms, and They were given provisions to last them until the Silk Project would be successful. Everything was subsidized and provided. This was fully funded for these people. As far as politics is concerned, there was no assembly at the beginning because it was complete paternalism. When they had an assembly later on, the numeraire for the society was the mulberry tree. So, quoting a man called McKinstry in 1930, he says, "Not only a man's wealth, but his value to society and his standing in the church and his hope for heaven were all gauged by mulberry trees." How many mulberry trees he planted. They implemented their egalitarian project by giving everybody 50 acres of free land. Slavery was forbidden because these people were to become productive, transformed. There was no market in land. If a male heir did not inherit the land, the land reverted back to the Georgia Project. And women were not assigned land. Now, you may think that this was some sort of discrimination intended, but it was not actually. In those days, women could inherit land. It seems that the reason why women were not allowed to own land or inherit land was they did not want the inequality of a woman marrying a man who also had land. Because then between them, of course, they would have 100 acres and not 50. The project was meticulously planned, almost naively. Each settlement was to have 116 houses. There was going to be a house for an overseer. There was common ground, the so-called commons that we know about, for the animals. And most importantly, every plot had to have an armed man there. As far as trade was concerned, quoting Mr. Huchner from 1902, there would be no merchants from neighboring colonies to sell Negroes, rum, or superior land. And the two things deemed most destructive of any settlement were rum and lawyers. Because of rum, you know, people drink too much and they can't work properly. And the lawyers, well, they are just instruments of contestability. Eventually, rum was allowed, but lawyers were never allowed in the settlement. And then the other aspect of the settlement was, and here it becomes strange and interesting, if you could get to Georgia on your own without them paying for you, they gave you 500 acres of land, 10 times as much. And your servants also received 20 to 25 acres of land, and everybody received mulberry trees to plant. The economic failure was evident already in 1741. Remember, they arrived in 1733. Now here's some data. In the years between 1732 and 41, 9 years, 1,800 settlers were brought out by the Georgia trustees. These people were the hopeless people, they called them, who had nothing and could do nothing, they assumed. And 1,000 settlers came out on their own money. And the trustees granted 60,000 acres. "1,000 acres had been cultivated by 1738, 1.7% of the land. And Stevens, in a book in 53, says, the extravagant plans of the trustees had simply vanished into nothing. It won't be completely nothing, but basically nobody was planting mulberry trees and nobody was feeding silkworms, and everybody was being subsidized who was a funded settler. So there was complete moral hazard. You could always say, it hasn't worked for me. So the project came to an end. In 1752, colony of Georgia was established. It was a British colony. Up till 1752, this was a private enterprise by a group of altruistic people who set to help out poor people. In 1738, women were permitted to inherit land. In 1739, land could be bequeathed to anybody. In 1741, they stopped out giving money to anybody. In 1750, land became saleable property, and in 1752, you could have slaves. So it all came to an end, as these type of systems do. But the important date is in 1739, about the time all these aspects of transition took place, war with Spain began. I'll come back to this. Now, before I go on to the story of this Georgia project, I'd like to look at economic systems. Suppose we are people who are interested in comparative economic systems. Then we want to know, was the Georgia project like anything else that ever existed? Because remember, the egalitarianism was in inputs, not in shared output. Well, we know that other egalitarian systems failed. Communism failed. We know it failed for essentially three reasons. Hayek's fatal conceit that you cannot transform people's nature. Coercion that was required because you could not transform people's nature. That was already in the Road to Serfdom in 1944. And we know from the Austrian school that the planners lacked information that markets can give you, and it was inevitable that they would be inefficient. None of these characteristics applied to the Georgia project. There was no fatal conceit because of shared output. There was no coercion. This is very important. If you came over there and they paid for you and you decided, I have enough, you actually just walk away. And if you walk away, you cross the river into South Carolina. And South Carolina is a normal place. There's a market for land, the slaves, and you can also get a job. Now, we know this was not like market socialism. It was a little bit like Cuba. You know that in Cuba, when Castro came to power, all property before 1960 was kept in private hands. And so this was a little bit like Georgia, in that when I was in Cuba, I understood that a very important asset of any young person was the house their parents had. Because when they married, this house was transferable. That's why all the cars, if you've been to Cuba, they're all the nice cars are pre-1960. Because they were private cars then, and they remain private cars. There's some similarity with the Chinese 1978 land reform, because the story is that the peasants informally privatized, but like in Georgia, they didn't own the land. The closest similarity I can find, and has nothing to do with, so whoever put Israel in the title of my talk, I said, I really don't know who did that or why they did that, but actually the Georgia project is very close to the kibbutz, the Israeli kibbutz. Now, why is that? It's close to the Israeli kibbutz in every way except in the Israeli kibbutz, it was socialism, that it was social property and social output. Because like in Georgia, these people who participated in this project in Georgia were all screened for industriousness, and that's what happens in the kibbutz. You go to live in the kibbutz for 1 year and they decide if they want you or not. Also, if you could walk away from the kibbutz. Anybody, no one has to stay in a kibbutz. In fact, my son-in-law had no choice but to walk away from the kibbutz with my daughter, because the kibbutz wouldn't let him study to be a veterinarian. On the kibbutz, they said it's unfair for him to study to be a veterinarian because that's a second degree, and some people on the kibbutz don't have a first degree. So the principle of equality seems to be the same, but we have no analogy from any system for what went wrong with Georgia. We have a similarity in the outcomes. Very few people seem to write about the forlorn circumstances of the ex-Soviet Union. Well, I was there. In the early 90s. I was on various missions with the World Bank, and I was just writing papers, essentially. And it was a lot like they say Georgia was. It was a wasteland in many ways, industrial wasteland. With that background, let's go to the reasons for the system failure. Why did Georgia fail? If you go to the history literature, they will tell you that Georgia failed because the settlers did not have aptitudes for producing silk. The settlers were urban dwellers, principally from London. And there are sad stories. They were given animals and they lost the animals. The animals wandered off. They had to build houses from wood for themselves. They didn't know how to do that. They weren't very good at hunting, so their diet was really limited. And I believe there was also hyperbolic discounting, meaning that I believe that you cannot tell people, plant this tree. How long does it take for a mulberry tree to have mulberry leaves that the silkworms can eat? It takes a few years. And in the meantime, these people are living off these subsidies. It turns out as well from the reports that we have, here's a report that silk production was very tiring and tedious, and these settlers became easily discouraged. And it must be tedious, isn't it? You cut leaves, you give them to the silkworms eat, they munch away, and there's very little actually done by the person who's in charge, and there was moral hazard, and there was soft budget. So what did the trustees in London do? They accused the settlers of being useless. They said, you are as useless in Georgia as you were in London. And I believe this has to do with eugenics. I have read the books by David Levy and Sandra Peart. As you know, at that time, eugenics was regarded as a truth. And the London trustees believed that they were superior genetically to the London poor. And they believed the London poor were poor because they were genetically inferior. And so they said, we made a mistake. We sent these people over to Georgia, believing they could do the simplest of tasks. Cut mulberry bushes and feed them to silkworms, and they did not do that. And they said, most condescendingly, in a quote from Bongstein, he says, it must be a weak hand. This is what they said about the settlers. It must be a weak hand indeed that they cannot earn bread where silkworms and white mulberry trees are so plenty. In other words, they thought these people could only grow silk. They believed there was no need for human transformation. If you read the literature, especially the books by Levy and Peart, a big debate was if you could take somebody who was eugenically inferior and transform this person to become superior. I've read some of that literature. It's quite amazing when you read it in the 20th and 21st century. There was no transformation required. And what I did was I set up a little model, and I decided not to set out the equations. I'll just tell my story. And my story is quite simple. I had efficient and inefficient settlers in Georgia. So it's like take a Ricardian model and you have fixed input-output coefficients. It could be comparative advantage, but it's not, because these two people don't trade with one another. One is efficient, one is inefficient in silk, and they buy some other good that we can call X. And they have an outside option for earning income. Now, there was an outside option. It turns out that the people there could earn 2 shillings a day by working at a hard job, and they would only earn 1 shilling a day feeding silkworms. But the trustees in London believed that all they were good for was feeding the silkworms. So I show that if there's no market in land, and the outside option can easily be superior to both the efficient and inefficient producers, and they both walk away from the project. If there's a market in land, the efficient producer buys the land of the inefficient producer. Remember, everyone has an equal land allocation, and they're not allowed to sell. So it's very easy to show in this type of model that no one wants to produce silk, and they walk away. And everybody is, in this case, everyone's useless. And everyone's useless, meaning nobody wants to produce silk. There's also literature which says that the reason why the project failed was rent seeking. And there's some truth to that. If you had land there, you knew that one day this project would fail, or you could help to make it fail. And if it failed, your land became marketable and you could use slaves to work your land. The main character of the story is called James Oglethorpe. He's a very, very interesting person. He was an English aristocrat. He joined the settlers in Georgia, and he was in charge of them. But actually, he was a general in the British Army, and he was offered bribes, large sums of money from the people in Carolina, because they said, if you are going to be here, this land is valuable. And he didn't accept the bribes. But in the end, the rents weren't very great, and I'll explain why. So they waited for the system to change. Now, if you look at the literature, we have to switch now from social and economic objectives to military objectives. Now, Georgia was contested territory between Spain and England. Moreover, England had actually agreed some years back in a treaty that Georgia belonged to the Spanish. And the Duke of Newcastle has an interesting quote. He was the main person involved in foreign affairs. He did not want war with Spain, but he said, however the right may be, it will now be pretty difficult to give up Georgia. So they succeeded in making a fait accompli in Georgia by putting these people there. The Spanish had their cause, and indeed, in 1739, war was declared between England and Spain. And when war was declared, Oglethorpe, who was in charge of the settlement, all of a sudden became a general. He made incursions into Spanish territory down into Florida, and he had to retreat. And when he retreated, everybody who was there all of a sudden realized that they were in danger. Certainly the Protestants were in danger. Do you know that the first settlement in North America, leaving out the Vikings in the north, was St. Augustine in Florida? And it had been founded by French Huguenots, Protestants. And when the Spanish came, they slaughtered all the Protestants. They left a few Frenchmen alive who were Catholics. How they proved they were Catholics, I know not. So everyone had reason actually to run away, and they did. The decisive battle took place in 1742. The Spanish attacked. They had 5,000 men. Oglethorpe had 1,000, and he beat them. And the reason that he beat the Spanish was that the battle took place on an island, and there was a swamp there, or a marsh. The Spanish didn't know the terrain. They went into this swamp, and that was the end of them. So now we come to our analytical question. We know the social and economic project failed, but the military project did not fail. So why were these settlers placed there? I believe, were they bait for the Spanish? Were they pawns to be moved about? And my question on top of that is, did these lower class London poor people know geography? Did they know where the English were sending them? I don't believe they did. They were moving into a buffer area between Spanish Florida and English Carolina that was actually not owned by anybody. So looking at the land and looking at everything that happened, it seems to me that everybody was useless for silk production because they were all rent-seeking. The rich ones, I don't think the poor people knew what was going on. This settlement was proclaimed as a private philanthropy, and people were asked to give money to help this settlement. But when it was all over, £155,000 sterling had been spent on this Georgia settlement, and 136,000 out of 150 was given by the English Parliament. So the English Parliament had a big interest in this settlement surviving. And also it turns out that the people across the river in South Carolina, which was formerly English, they had an interest in having a buffer against the Spanish, and they gave much land, they gave provisions to help out these poor settlers who were there not knowing quite what to do. So looking at it retroactively, obviously, what were all these rules about? These rules are not about egalitarian ideology. These rules maximize the number of free men who, in the event of a war, would be in Georgia. The slaves are not allowed. Women could not inherit the land. It had to be a man. Every house had to have an armed person. And so the egalitarianism went two ways. On the one hand, you can say that it was a philosophy of people being equal, but on the other hand, it had a military purpose. I will take a couple of minutes to talk about the Salzburgers and the Jews because they are so interesting. The charter that George II gave to the London trustees said anybody can come to Georgia who is not a papist. Jews are not papists. So Jews in principle could have come, but they allowed no Jews to come. But then, just a few weeks after they arrived, the original settlers, a ship appeared out of nowhere with Jews. Quite amazingly, because they had a very hard time. The ship nearly sank a couple of times. What had happened was that Jews from Portugal and a few Jews from Europe who spoke Yiddish, which is close to German, had been sent by the London Jews. The London Jews were wealthy, I guess, and they were traders. And these people couldn't speak English very well, and they didn't want to keep subsidizing them. So they sent them off to this Georgia settlement. When they arrived there and the trustees learnt that they were there, they immediately told Oglethorpe, the leader there, to expel them. And Oglethorpe refused to expel them. He said, these are an industrious group of people, and I'm keeping them. Another interesting part of the story is that when the Jews arrived, there was an epidemic taking place in the settlement. People were dying. More than 10% of the population died. And the doctor in the settlement had died as well. And the Jews had a doctor. And he succeeded in stopping the epidemic. I just read an article the other day. I'm trying to find out how he did that. There's an article in the Journal of the Royal Society of Medicine, 2014, by Eric Altschuler and Aisha Yobenputra, where they try to work out what actually was the epidemic. It doesn't matter what it was. They thought, people have written that it was yellow fever. They say it can't be yellow fever, and it can't be there was an influenza epidemic in Europe, but it wouldn't have taken so long for the epidemic to hit the settlers. They say that there was a gastroenteric disease, but it doesn't matter. The point is that either this Jewish doctor saved the settlement, or it was no causality. It was just random, just correlation. But Oglethorpe refused to expel them, and so they stayed. And then the London trustees said they must not have land. But Oglethorpe disobeyed that as well. But of course they didn't want land. As you all know, Jews did not want to own land, because the history of the Jews in Europe had been that if you own land, you're bound to lose, because when you have to run away, as they had to run away from so many places, they had to take with them human capital, basically. That's Kuznets' story. That's why they invested in human capital, and probably when my father and grandfather invested in they had a sewing machine. If you ran away, I suppose you could take your Singer sewing machine. The Salzburgers, I will say it in English. I suppose in German it said Salzburger, isn't it? There's no plural. But the Salzburgers are even more interesting. The Salzburgers lived in the Catholic diocese of the Archbishop of Salzburg. They lived in a valley, and they were Protestants. And they were hiding from the Catholics that they were Protestants, which is quite amazing, because most of the Jews are Portuguese Jews, and they were hiding in Portugal from the Inquisition that they were not Christians. The Salzburgers were expelled quite terribly. 30,000 of them were expelled for being Protestants. In the bad weather, 4,000 of them died. And it was all very unsatisfactory ethically. They were not allowed to take their children with them. Just as the Portuguese Jews, when they were expelled, could not take their children. The argument, of course, was that if these heretics took their children, the children will go to hell. If they stayed under the auspices of the church, they will go to heaven. The Salzburgers were invited by King George II to come to Georgia. They came, and they actually produced silk. They actually planted the trees. They were successful. An evaluation that I have from 1855 is that if all the population consisted of Salzburgers, and they needed the Jews for another reason, which I'll explain, the project would have worked. Now, the Salzburgers were very religious, and when they were given the trees, they had to plant them, because it would have been theft had they not planted them. It turns out the Jews were also very religious, because there's a story that a Salzburger woman gave a Jewish woman 1 crown, and she should have given her half a crown. So when the Jewish woman returned to her house, her husband saw that they'd overpaid. He went back to the Salzburgers and said, "Here, take back your money, because if I take money that does not belong to me, there will be no blessing in my house." So the Salzburgers and the Jews were ethical. And that's why in the correct title of my paper, I have ethical behavior. Now, the Salzburgers arrived a few weeks after the Jews. The epidemic was over, and there were Jews there who said to the Salzburgers, "Wie geht es? Guten Tag, welcome, willkommen," because they could speak Yiddish, which was very close, apparently, to the German dialect that the Salzburgers spoke. They were productive. We know there are different reasons now about the Protestant ethic. It could be that your success in this life is the precursor to your success in the next life. It could be, as some people have written, that this coincided with the printing press. It coincided with literacy for women. But certainly the Salzburgers were very productive. When there was a response to danger, this is interesting. The Spanish were down the road. When the Jews realized the Spanish were down the road, they left in a hurry. There's a recording of a case where somebody went to the Jewish neighborhood and there was nobody there. They'd gone overnight because they didn't want to face the Inquisition. They ran away from the Inquisition. The Salzburgers did not run away. Why? Well, my interpretation is that the Inquisition in Austria didn't kill them. They took the children, but they expelled them. It could be, some people have said, that they were very religious, very pious. They believed that if they die, they will go to heaven. And of course, the Jews did not believe that. Jews believed that one day the Messiah will come and take them back to the land of Israel. And so they ran away waiting for the Messiah. And some of my people are still waiting for the Messiah, as you know. But this was the ideology at the time. Oglethorpe, who was in charge, would not do anything that would prevent the Salzburgers and the Jews from helping out the colony and being productive, helping out the settlement at that time. He knew that the Jews would not fight and the Salzburgers would not fight when the Spanish came. The Salzburgers said that we will not fight because we are pacifists. And the Jews said we don't know how to fight. In fact, as you know, in the Christian world, going back to those times, the Jews had no weapons. They're not allowed to have weapons. So even though he knew these two groups of people would not help him against the Spanish, he kept them there. Well, that's my story. I can just summarize it maybe in a couple of sentences. We don't know if the settlement was for...
Να δώσω την ψυχή μου για με όλους τους άλλους τρόπους, αλλά να πάω.
Wenn Sie sprechen Deutsch, können Sie bitte langsam sprechen?
This was in Greek. I don't know.
She's speaking German. It's too. I can understand, but I need, you know. Was hat passiert jetzt? Okay, I'll go on because I'm right at the end. I'm just going to summarize.
Go on, Arye. Mach weiter.
Okay, I'm finished. But here is the summary. We don't know why that settlement was started. This was for me a detective story. I'm reading a book on the American colonies and I come across egalitarianism. And I think, haha, I'm going to add this to the egalitarian systems that we economists study. Because communism came much later. There was another settlement in New Bedford, I'm told. But basically, it was for me the idea that egalitarianism existed way before Marx and Engels and Lenin. But then it turns out that egalitarianism was not in output, it was in input. Then, as I went through this, I said the project could have a dual purpose. It was obvious in the end that the military project succeeded, the social and economic project did not. I believe, looking at the data, that the trustees, knowing that they believed in eugenics, they gave 500 acres to their own people, upper class, because they believed the upper class were more competent. The upper class did nothing. They grew no silk. They were waiting for the project to end and to get the rents from the land and slavery. They accused the lower classes that they brought out there of being useless. Useless is not a nice word, and that's the word they used in English. I believe they brought the people out there only well, I think there was some deceit from the trustees. James Oglethorpe is a hero. Everyone knows he's a hero. I found later that there is a university called James Oglethorpe University. I believe the first capital city of Georgia before they moved to, where are they now? I don't think Atlanta is the capital. I don't know where is it. But Oglethorpe really wanted this to succeed socially and economically. He spent £9,000 of his own money, which is a fortune. But you know, the Parliament gave it back to him after Georgia became a crown colony. He catered to the Salzburgers and the Jews. He realized these people were productive for their own reasons. And he knew neither of this group was of military use. So that tells me I believe the trustees were not completely honest. I believe Parliament was not completely honest when they set up this egalitarian settlement. I believe the egalitarianism was designed to maximize the number of people with guns, because they saw in the other colonies that very rich people bought all the land and they used slaves, and there were very few free people because they used slaves on the plantations. So they made sure there were no slaves. And as we know, a simple exercise, you want to maximize the number of people, minimize the number of land you give them. And if you got land, if you received land because you were from the upper class, the 500 acres, you had to bring men with you, so-called retainers. Well, that's my story of, as I said, we're storytellers. I told this story. I do not believe that we economists know a lot about this story, because even my friends who are economic historians know they know that there was this settlement in Georgia, but they do not realize the political economy of it all. So this paper is incomplete. I was apprehensive about giving this paper. I usually give you a paper with equations and models and empirical evidence, which we couldn't get on this. So I thank you for Manfred for inviting me, and I thank the rest of you. If you have any comments, please.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much.
Well, thank you.
Thank you, Harry. Thank you. Interesting.
Well, is there anybody who wants to speak first? Because I want to say several things about it.
No, please go ahead.
Okay.
So I need a pen.
Well, thank you very much, Arye. I really loved it. And as much as it doesn't have equations and it's not yet formalized, I think this was a more genuine economic research question than anything that I have heard in the last several years, at least, because it's a real problem. And also, I think it also has a replica in much more recent events, and the way, especially for the way that the UK tries to solve the problem of inequality. And I have in mind the target system, and I'll come back to this at the end of the comments that I want to share with you. So you mentioned that you have looked at it from a Ricardian point of view and then from a Rand point of view. But I think what this case illustrates best is the cultural economics point of view. And you have touched on this at places talking about the ethical, but it comes much more clear if we think of the problem as a problem of decisions biased for cultural reasons, and it exists on several levels. So first, of course, the human capital thing that you mentioned. If we look at the individual level, you have the people with low skills being sent there, but there is also the problem of communication, and this is a bias which is driven by the conceit that you were saying. So the communication with them in terms of the targets, in terms of what they have to do, in terms of why they're sent, and so on and so forth. Then there is the second individual level cultural aspect, the personal attitude. And for this, there is a lot of literature. So you cannot have a person be entrepreneurial, do things just by instruction. It is a question of self-selection. And these people didn't have these things, right? They were just put there without even knowing why. So this is yet another aspect. And then you were saying that no, I won't go in this direction. Then there is the aspect of the trust, because if you were sent there by an institution that you already do not trust, and an institution that you obviously hate because you have been one of the poor, one on the street, you feel that something is happening to you by a negative power rather than something that is giving you a chance. So your whole perception of the situation is different in how they were behaving there with regards to the relation with the institutions that send them. Then there was a whole host of problems on a more aggregate level with institutions which were set, because in the way that you were, the new institutions in the new place, the way that you were describing, it, and maybe the way that it happened, they meant to make an egalitarian place with very nice institutions, but they didn't really sound to me to be like this. The first thing that you said about the men and the women not being able to marry with each other, the reasoning for this to be egalitarian didn't really make sense, because then why not make all women have the right to have land and no men to have?
Indeed, but you know, Annie, they could marry. They were allowed to
They
marry,
could marry, but
but she could
why
not.
the
She could
women
not
were the
bring
ones that
land into the marriage.
they could, but still, there is one group. This is a replication of the inequality, which in unequal treatment. Then this part was the most horrendous one, where they didn't have the right to have lawyers. Now the whole emergence of institutions, and in a natural way, in a natural society, is you want the society to become trustworthy, to become safe, right? And there are certain things which are cultural norms, which naturally emerge as the culture of the society. And then you have the formal institutions, which are set in order to guard those part of the rights which are more difficult to maintain in the group. And they didn't allow these last parts to emerge. And this is a prerequisite to guarantee that unfair things will be happening there without anybody being able to claim protection for the
But Annie, they didn't need
abuse.
protection. With all the trustees were trustees of the land, and there was no contestable property there.
Yeah, but if there is,
I
it's not
mean,
possible not to have problems in a society. If you do not have the right to protest and to
what
defend
could they
yourself,
protest about? Okay, fine. They were.
and this is
Thank you for
part
your
of human
comments. I
nature
want
in
to
a
say,
different way,
actually,
the Hayekian story. It's human nature is not only about well, my interest. Human nature is also about ego, and there will be people who have certain egos, and there will be always conflicts and disputes between people. And if this cannot be resolved, mm, this is a
there
society which
were conflicts because all the land was not homogeneous, and some people did receive better land. But I've studied now mulberry trees, would you believe? It turns out that they are quite resilient, and it doesn't matter how bad the land is, they can grow. You know, I should add, given what Annie said, they did not have any conflict with the Indians. I don't want to call them Indians, I call them Native Americans. In fact, there was a group of people who had not got along with their main tribe, and they had settled somewhere near the area where they came, and they gave them money, and there was no problem with the Indians, except, as you know, that to the east, the French were there, and they were using the Indians as mercenaries, and the Spanish problem for the English was that if a slave ran away and made it to Spanish territory, that slave, if the slave agreed to become a Catholic, became a free person. So Spanish Florida was always a problem for the English, actually. I believe they wanted to they didn't get the Spanish out of there. You know, the Americans bought Florida from the Spanish in the 1900s. But thank you. I think
no, but there
there's a
is a
problem.
level of social biases. I'll finish only with this thing. The first is that just like social media replicates our biases as a society nowadays, the same way they created this extra society in Georgia, which then incorporated all the possible, isolations. The Jews were always prosecuted, so they were prosecuted in this place.
The
This
Jews
kind
are
of.
not prosecuted. They were not.
Well, in
The
history, Jews
trustees
are
said you
very
don't.
often prosecuted. And this is exactly what happened
It's
to them there.
true. What is true, Annie, what you're saying is the fugitives from poverty did not succeed. But the fugitives from, let's call it religion, they did succeed. And we have to be careful these days. I don't know what to say in the context of the sort of ideology that I find in the United States now. Sandra Peart and David Levy, who have this very good books on eugenics, wanted to give a talk about eugenics at the American Economic Association. and they were told to change their title and not put their eugenics. Eugenics is an awful ideology. It says it's a politics of identity from the beginning. It says what you are born is what you are, and some people are inferior. So there were races that were inferior.
Yeah, this I believe it, but it's also a question of good intentions and not understanding really the problem. And it's the same what happens now with this target system in the educational system in the UK. They want it to promote somehow equal difficulty at school for people who are coming from poor origins and people who are coming from rich families, and that's why they will have lower targets for people who are coming from the poor families, without thinking and without understanding that actually they're deepening the inequality because they transform it from economic into a knowledge inequality between people. So
okay,
you see,
I think
again,
culture is, I agree with you, culture is important, Annie, but we have to be careful with culture, because culture says, the anthropologists say you can't change culture very quickly. And then people are condemned to their culture. So
the problem is not only to understand, but to control it in your own decisions.
Gloria, you wanted to say.
Maybe I can answer these questions later. Any?
Yeah.
Thank you for your comments.
Gloria, you wanted to give a comment?
Oh, is it on?
Raised my hand.
Oh, yeah. I'm here in Tucson, Arizona, and I've worked with Native Americans for years as a tutor and various things. And while this was a very good presentation, and I understand that the lens is economics, I do believe that land ownership is economics. And I was quickly reading over some of the tribal histories in preparation for coming to this talk. And this woman, Mary Musgrove, is definitely a key figure. She was evidently the Creek and Georgian Indians were related, and Mary Musgrove was a mixed race woman who was able to make these connections, but she did not make any importance in the talk. And I'm just saying that this is what the meaning of invisibility is, when your whole group is not important enough, although they have lived on these lands for 10,000 years, to factor in. And there, I don't expect that we'll, how can I put this, solve land rights things in a couple sentences. And
Gloria, I agree with you about land, but when I was making up this talk, first of all, the relations with the Indians were good. There was no contested. There was no.
I don't know what.
There was no contested. Later on, there was trouble with the Creek Indians, and later on, they were actually they were very bad to the Indians of Florida and to the Cherokees. But this is much later.
No. In the 1700s, there was a war called the Tillau War in Georgia. And these things are out there. It's just that I think the sources.
Yeah, but it was after 1750. After 1752.
Could I finish my sentence just a minute?
Sure.
When you're looking at one lens, economics, it's very hard. I grant you to cover everything else. But these two mental universes of the Native Americans and the European colonizers, who often just start with their narrative of we gave land here and we own land there. It wasn't recognized by most of the tribes, according to many sources I'm reading. So I do think that your sources are also secondary sources. Go to the primary source.
Of course they are. I said that at the beginning. I rely on secondary sources.
But the treaties.
I rely very much on Professor Sweet. But
the treaties. The treaties are actually at the Library of Congress, the primary source treaties with the Georgian Indians. Now, maybe this is not the focus of this talk.
Can you tell me the year of the treaty you're talking about?
There were 10 treaties with these Georgian.
When did they start? When did they start?
They started in the early, they started around 1735. And plus, the Georgian Indians were much more decimated by the plagues than the Europeans. You said, 10% of the Europeans, up to 50% of these Georgian indigenous people were wiped out at that same time. And none of this made a mention in, just saying, oh, the relations were fine. I don't know anywhere in this country that the relations were fine during the expansion period, except maybe Pennsylvania with William Penn, because he really considered Native Americans to have souls, which most of the Europeans did not. So there is a big problem with reading secondary sources, but I would, as an English major, I would recommend that you go to the primary source documents, which are those treaties. And so it's an origin problem. Who has the original right to this land? It's not only.
Gloria, thank you. I appreciate what you're saying, and I certainly will have a look at what happened, because the books that I've read by historians do not point to any conflict between the settlement at Savannah in the period that is of interest to us, which is between 1733 and 1752, I believe, when Georgia became a crown colony. I know there are wars. I've heard about Musgrave, the Musgrave woman, lady, but I had two questions. Why did the project fail? And was it really a social project, or was it a facade for a military objective?
Well, how
And
could
none of those, and that's my focus.
Yeah.
What I was told, what I read, was the Indians didn't come into this.
Well, you
The
see, that's
settlement failed, actually, because
That's-
everybody left.
no, there were diseases, there were problems with the Native Americans, and they weren't the only factor, but to leave that out, you know, it's.
I have to leave it out because it does not address my question. How does it address my question?
I think that they may have been a factor in the relations with the settlers, may have been a factor. They were certainly sharing diseases. The same diseases in the same years you were talking about were in both communities, and various things. I don't know why these. I think a one crop agricultural economy is always bad. It's bad nowadays. We talk about that. If they were set up as a one crop economy, no wonder they had problems. You don't know about whether the silkworms were
It's
dying.
called a cash crop. They had one cash crop, which was silk, for which they were given inputs and they had a guaranteed price for output that was profitable. But the economy was there besides the silk. I'll look into it.
Yeah, well,
there is a book by Julianne Sweet on the Indian War. There was an Indian War.
that was the Tillau War, or however it's pronounced. Yeah,
Yeah, I've heard of that war as well.
that was in 1730 something. I'm a new student in Georgia.
Okay. Thank you for your advice, and I will certainly look into this more.
Dan, your microphone is not on. Stan,
It's on now. Yeah.
Okay.
Arye, if the project ultimately was essentially a military venture or operation, and it's hard to think that the British Parliament would be funding this thing to the extent that
90% of the money, Stan, came from the British Parliament. Yeah.
Yeah, they were not altruistic, were they?
No, they were not. No.
And I just wondered if you could say something more about the military aspect of it, and I mean,
I can't.
if there's any evidence that, or what the evidence is that the this project in particular, and projects like this, in fact, had a role to play in keeping the Spanish out of the American colonies, ultimately.
Well, that's my basic conclusion in the end, that Oglethorpe, who is very well known in Georgia, I believe, in a sense, he may have saved Western civilization. The literature says that had Oglethorpe lost the battle on St. Simon's Island, I believe, against the Spanish, then Georgia would have been Spanish-speaking, and the Spaniards would have gone up the coast and just taken the colonies. Well, if that's the case, the hacienda system, which was used in Latin America and South America, would have been transposed, to the American colonies. America would have become Latin America. I don't know what would have happened to Canada where you live. But without the United States as a free country, willing to participate in Europe's wars, World War I and World War II, who knows what would have happened. So I think Oglethorpe deserves a lot of credit for what happened there. There was one decisive battle. That was the island, St. Simon's Island. The 5,000 force that the Spanish had brought, I think they went into a bog or a swamp or something, and Oglethorpe beat them back. So that's so there was one decisive battle, Stan. And Oglethorpe lost a lot of little skirmishes. He took his men into Spanish Florida, and he was forced to retreat. And when the Jews and the others saw him retreating, they figured out what was going on, and they left. And they all left in 1741, whereas the decisive battle was not until 1742. The interesting thing is that for a long time, hardly anyone came back. And why? And I believe one aspect of it is the weather. I've read that Atlanta was a poor city, a poor town, until air conditioning became prevalent. The humidity, what do you call them there? The cyclones, you don't call them, the hurricanes they're called there. Maybe it wasn't a great place to live, Georgia. Because by the time of the American Revolution, it was quite desolate. So, yeah.
Okay. Well, if nobody else has a question or a comment, I have one or two. The first is, of course, it's a very convincing story, Ari, which you told us. And of course, I wouldn't relate it to Georgia, but when you look into history, it's actually very common, that, for instance, retired soldiers got land in what's today Romania. The Romans did it, and all kinds of things. So history is filled up with cases, that poor people are sent to the borders, given land, and then just go ahead. Maybe it's not as explicit in your case, and in your case, it's very surprising because we have these other stories, which is not military, but when you look in history, then they're all, to protect the border, you give settlers land and all that.
Yes.
It's very common.
The Cossacks. Yeah. The Russians sent the Cossacks out to the borders.
Yeah. For instance, I mean, it's enormous cases, or the Germans, which had to go to down the Danube, and so one reason was, first to protect against the Awaren, this Heinrich the Lion sent them there, the founder of Munich, and to send them there, to protect, and all this, and then, but this is one issue I want to mention, and the second is, of course, there were these utopians around. I mean, I didn't read Thomas More's recently. The difference, I think, with Georgia and this Thomas More's Utopia is that in Thomas More's Utopia, there was no private property. As far as I remember, it was even not allowed to have money. But one reason was, of course, to have an egalitarian society, where it was, so to say, the target. And here, in your case, it's, so to say, the starting point, the egalitarian society. But of course, it
lasted for 10 years. Yeah, it was not until the year before that it became a British colony that they allowed a market in land and they allowed slavery.
Yeah, so
the big rents would have come then. I agree completely, but the parliament at the beginning were making all the statements how we are going to send poor people to Georgia where they will reconstruct themselves. Yeah. And then as I go on, I realize they're sending these people who have no idea where they're going into this buffer zone between Spain and the English colony of South Carolina.
Yeah.
That's not very honest. I
Well,
believe
I'm
if you
sure.
give these people a map of the world as they had in those days, these are
Yeah.
the lowest of low class from London. They
Yeah.
don't know where Georgia is. They
Yeah.
don't know where Spanish America is.
Yeah.
So there was
Yeah.
deception here.
Yeah, but I'm also sure these people who were sent to protect Germany, well, in quotation mark, because Germany did not exist, against the Awaren, they didn't know
You
where
think
they
so?
were sent. That was 1150 about, so the 1150, the people didn't have any idea about
No, they
this,
did
what
not.
is 50 miles away, and still, I mean, they moved there, and yeah, also they were promised something, well, they were promised land, by the way. Okay, so there are similarities at least. What I like is, that you get
Yes, I will do this. Yeah,
Mhm.
I then
I will.
it,
So,
may
Peter
I
and
may I just add a little comment?
Barbara, go
I
ahead and
think I have the yeah. May I add
go,
a little? I have the
Yeah.
feeling that in London, quite a few people, rich people, wanted to get just rid of these poor people. I mean, just the very idea to send these people, I mean, give them these ideas about equality and so on, which they didn't understand anyway, I suppose. But to make them build or plant silk trees, and I mean, it's not easy to produce silk. It's a real, it's a business that needs knowledge and so on. I mean, I just don't understand what
Okay, Barbara,
else should be the
they sent along. They gave them Italians who taught them how to unravel the silk cocoon.
Mhm.
The hard part is unraveling the silk cocoon, but the Salzburger women knew how to do it.
okay, but
Actually,
they
what
came later, if I understood correctly.
only no, they came. Yes, they came later, but only by 4 months or 5 months
Ah, yeah,
later.
okay, okay.
And in fact, the only reason there was any silk at all was because of the Salzburger.
Hmm.
Okay.
I don't know what they expected from these other people. I think you are right that they just wanted to get rid of them,
Yeah,
and they
do
used
you
this
have
ideology to.
yeah?
But
So,
Oglethorpe took it seriously.
mm,
He actually believed they could do it, and that's why he didn't expel the Jews, and that's why he gave the Salzburgers many more trees than anybody else.
mhm.
And the egalitarian system broke down with the Salzburgers because he saw they're the only ones who are planting the trees.
May I
And
ask
by
one?
Oh,
May I ask one more question? Do you know whether, in the end, any silk was produced and sent over to England?
yes, it was produced and sent over,
Ah,
and it
yeah,
was produced it was produced by the Salzburgers.
yeah,
mhm.
yeah,
And
yeah.
after it became an English colony, only the Salzburgers were producing silk.
Hmm.
Okay.
And there is a society now in Georgia called the Salzburger Society. Very
Oh,
interesting,
really?
and they're promoting the memory of the original Salzburger.
Hmm.
But it's amazing that these people succeeded,
Hmm.
and
Is
the
there
other
still
people
a
did not.
silk is there still a silk tradition in Georgia? I've never heard about that, but maybe there is. Do you know?
It's a very, it's beyond the time that I was interested in. Uh,
Okay,
maybe there
okay.
is. Maybe, but I
Yeah.
know that little children grow silk,
Yeah.
right? You give them silkworms, and you give them branches of the mulberry tree.
Hmm.
That was very condescending to these men to tell them that the only thing they can do is watch silkworms munch.
Mhm.
This was the eugenics of these aristocrats.
Mm.
Okay, we have another question. Mr. Owner. Just go ahead, please.
Peter, we need
Mr. Owner.
you as
Yes, please. I can't remember his name offhand, but there was one American Native American Indian who suggested that if everything carries on according to the ways of the white man, whether the white man was English speaking or Spanish speaking or French speaking or whatever speaking, but if we carry on according to the ways of the white man, there'll be no more wild animals, there'll be no more forests, and the only thing that will be left will be money. And maybe what they had was civilization. Thank you.
Yes, well, money would be useless if you had no animals. It's really beyond my theme. I can see how you want to go that way. I'm interested also now in the woke ideology in America, where compensation goes backwards now. You have intergenerational justice, but because you, being a white man, all your wealth derives from slavery in the past, you need to compensate the people who's. But excuse me, I'm not going to answer that. Hope somebody else does. Yeah, but I agree with you that mankind has been quite bad. You look at everything, overfishing.
But didn't you say that they didn't want to invite the Jews, and then it was the London Jews that organized themselves to send them? I think this
The London Jews organized themselves, came there without being invited.
Yeah, that's weird. All of it is weird. First of all, why they decided not to?
The Jews did strange things. I agree with you, but the London Jews didn't want them. This is a part of history.
So
if you ask,
sort of an internal eugenics based on who is rich?
It's a part of culture, like you said. If you look at me, if someone says to me, I have to say, ik ben een Ostjude, right? And I speak, my first language is Yiddish, and I didn't speak Hochdeutsch. And the other Jews in Germany spoke Hochdeutsch. And they thought they were culturally superior to the Ostjude. And the same story in London. Along come the Portuguese Jews, who are, what have they got? They had to run away from Portugal. And the Ashkenazi Jews came from Europe, but they had nothing. So they decided, we'll send you off to Georgia. Who will care? But that's a side story. I mean, the story there is that these two refugee groups could have actually made the project work if there were enough of them. And that lets us into all sorts of issues of culture that we don't want to go down that road. Because that's a very sensitive road to go down.
Yeah, but it may hold the answer.
Sorry?
But it may hold the answer, so...
I read a book now by Thomas Sowell on the culture of... People have a culture of productiveness. He couldn't have written that book now. He wrote it some years back. I mean, this is also the Protestant ethic. And I don't want to say anything demeaning about, on the contrary, the trustees in London accused the poor people from London of being useless. In a dispatch, you are as useless in Georgia as you are in London. And my model shows they were not useless at all. It was the incentive system of this egalitarian land allocation which made not worthwhile. The unproductive guy couldn't do anything, and the productive guy couldn't get any more land to make more, to make it worthwhile. So they all left. So these trustees in Georgia created the problem themselves. It had nothing to do with eugenics. It had everything to do with the incentives of the system. Right? So we're not saying it was cultural at all. Anyway, thank you, everybody. If anybody wants a copy of this paper, my email is available readily, either on my department webpage or on Google. If there are no more questions, I'm not the chair, but maybe I seem to have taken up my time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Wonderful. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you, Harry.
Well, thank you very much. I hope to see you all one day in real life.
Yeah.
And it was
So-
great to see you again, Harry. We haven't seen for years now, huh?
Well, yeah, we met in Munich and then we met in Hamburg a little while back. Thank you very much. Have a good evening.
Okay.
Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.